Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Word on the Snakevine. I'm your host Ross Deacon, and on this podcast we talk all things about venomous animal related, from venom research, venomous animal husbandry, animal conservation, herping, and of course snakebite and snakebite initiatives all around this world. On this episode, I have joining me as my co-host.
Hi, I'm Denny.
Hey, I'm Squirrel.
Hi, I'm Ed. And before we start, I have to do a few formalities. Any views expressed in this episode are the views of the guest host, not for the facility or the company they work for.
And today we are doing a special on the bushfires in Australia. So today we have Scott Eipper joining us from Nature for You. How are you today, Scott?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. How are you going?
I'm okay. It's nice and early in the morning here, as usual, when we record with you guys over the other side of the world. But no doubt it's late evening for you guys. But so I think we'll go straight into it, because I think with the natural disaster that is happening in Australia right now, I think the world's press is obviously jumped on it quite considerably, and I think people, even though the press are talking about it, I think maybe our understanding of it all and the actual severity of it all is probably not necessarily correct. So kind of, I know in the areas, from talking to you, the area where you are, you're not necessarily as affected as others. However, I think, as you were saying, your air quality is really low right now and stuff. So kind of, how did the bushfires start and in what areas?
So in Australia, we've got a fairly dry environment. We've got a lot of dry eucalyptus trees and dry habitats, grasslands, etc. And basically what happens is we've built a lot of our cities around areas of within these dry forests. Now, dry forests have a fairly large fuel load. At this time of year, which is in the peak of summer, we also tend to get a lot of thunderstorms and lightning strikes. Then hit the ground. They will actually cause fires to break out, and then fires will burn through the bush and burn out sections of the bush. And usually they would, historically, they would continue to burn until they hit a barrier, whether that be a river or a change in habitat or something like that tends to stop the fires from continually burning, or if there was a big storm or something like that would actually put the fire out. With habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation, and habitat modification, and humans putting houses everywhere, we've fragmented up the bush, and we're putting in these fire regimes, and these fire regimes have been, what they tend to do is they tend to burn during the cooler months of the year, and they'll actually burn leaf litter and stuff like that to get the fuel loads down. We, over the last couple of years in southeastern Australia, we've been experiencing some pretty significant droughts. Couple that with high fuel loads, low burning, low amounts of burning that they can do during the winter months at the moment due to those fuel loads and those winds and stuff like that, and warmer temperatures. We are experiencing warmer temperatures than we ever have before in Australia. Probably realistically a sign of climate change.
I think we are seeing that all over the world, aren't we? That increase in temperature. Like, we're now getting summers in the UK that I've never remembered before. Like, the last couple of years has been extraordinarily hot and stuff. And I think we're seeing similar things, a similar pattern.
So in Sydney, which is about 1,000 kilometres south of where I am, I suppose at least the listeners have got to remember that in the southern hemisphere, it's obviously that's warmer the further you go north. So I'm about 1,000 kilometres north of Sydney, and Sydney has just recently experienced temperatures in excess of 48 degrees Celsius. It has never ever been that hot in Sydney. You couple that with winds that are blowing from the centre of Australia, so you've got very hot winds blowing from the centre of Australia, that are hot and dry. Those winds are then fanning those fires, or that oxygen goes in the fires and makes those fires so much more intense. The sheer size of these fires, to give people a bit of an understanding of just how big some of these fires are, you could fit about half of Europe into the areas that have been burnt. It's pretty incredible how big these fires are. And so obviously there's been a huge cost to people and land and stuff like that, but there's also been a massive cost to wildlife as well. Some of the figures that have been put out there, at first glance or first hearing, people seem to think they're a little bit erroneous. This is sourced from Professor Chris Dixon of the University of Sydney. He's an ecologist of over 30 years' experience, so that this guy sort of does actually have a pretty good understanding of what he's doing. Conservative estimates are 800 million individual animals killed. Now, this is only for mammals, birds, and reptiles. It completely excludes insects, fish, and frogs. Obviously, that's a massive hit. On top of that, you're going to have prey animals feral animals that are going to be able to pick off some of the existing natives. You're going to have further effects in regards to vegetation loss. So if you don't have vegetation, you don't have our herbivorous animals aren't going to have the correct thing to eat, and then they also don't have the habitat there that they need. So, it's pretty incredible to have lost that many specimens of wildlife. And the densities that they work on are densities based on previous ecological studies that have looked at wildlife densities, and then they've used that density and then extrapolated that across the areas that have been burnt. So that they have got a fairly good handle on how many animals have been killed, which is pretty nuts.
And I think we've got to remember as well, a lot of these animals are, as you say, specific to Australia as well. They're not found anywhere else. And are we actually going to end up in extinction events for certain number of them animals, those species? Are we going to end up? We don't know if these are going to drive them extinct just yet. It's quite a shocking thing, really.
Well, I mean, there's some interesting things. I suppose to relate it back to reptiles, one animal that's going to have a rough time of it at some of its locations, and I do want to stress that it's only some of their locations. Broad-headed snakes, Hoplocephalus bungaroides, which is a beautiful little elapid from around the Sydney Basin. They in winter they shelter under sandstone slabs. And then during summer, radiotelemetry studies historically have shown that they tend to move into hollows in eucalyptus trees in dry forest. So they've shifted into the eucalyptus forest at probably the worst time for them to shift into the eucalyptus forest. They've been already threatened. There's a threatened species from habitat fragmentation and destruction already, so this is certainly going to put further pressure on some of their locations that they are still found. So until I suppose we get out and start looking for them in winter, we won't really know how badly affected they've been. So there is going to be that run-on effect. There's some colleagues of mine. They were doing some video surveillance of some small mammals. So they had a thing that they call camera traps out in some remote parts of Gippsland. It would seem of the 250 cameras that they had out, they've got about 100 cameras left. So, if you could imagine if you were plotting a whole heap of areas to survey, you would have that many things that had been burnt out. It's going to put a pretty significant toll on these already sort of threatened populations. And I don't think we'll really know the extent of that for quite some time.
It's a scary thought, though, isn't it? That you think that they put those cameras in those positions, knowing that there is a population within those areas, and now they're just gone. It's
Yep.
It's quite scary. I did read in the news a couple of days ago that they thought some of these bushfires have been actually based on arson attacks in certain areas. I don't know
Yep.
how true that is. Or...
There is no doubt about that at all. So it would seem that I mean we have a bushfire season obviously in Australia, so we do get bushfires. Like everywhere, there are people out there that are mentally unbalanced and they get excited by the look of fire and all the rest of it, and they feel that they need to burn things. Yeah, it looks like I think the reports are currently at the moment that about 15 of the fires that have been deliberately lit, including one apparently by a firefighter themselves, which is pretty disappointing to say the least. Unfortunately, we're always going to have to deal with that here in Australia. It's one of those things. Unfortunately, there's just no way around it.
I think while we're on that note, it's quite a good thing to specify that there is in certain locations around the world there is seasons of fire. California has one in their spruce forests. It's well known that they have yearly fires. In certain areas in Australia, they also have yearly fires, and the Amazon also has fires as well yearly. And I think we need to understand that the press sometimes, especially like the Amazon one this year, they exaggerated the fact that the Amazon was on fire last year. However, that happens yearly, and actually last year's was kind of about a normal size. What we're seeing in Australia right now is not the normal size of the bushfires. It is considerably bigger. I think that's what people need to sometimes understand, that we do have these burning events. However, this burning event is rather large compared to what it should be.
Well, I think rather large is like putting a Band-Aid on an artery, on a gaping artery. It's a bit of an underestimate there. We're dealing with fires that are around, from some reports, anywhere between 20 and 40 times larger than our typical fire season. So it's pretty incredible how big these fires are. But you're quite right in what you're saying in regards to our fire ecology. We have quite a number of plants over here that the only way that they seed is through fire events. There's a grass tree, Xanthoria. They will only seed, and the seed will only germinate after a fire. And normal fire and mosaic fires are actually quite a healthy thing for the environment, in that they burn off a lot of the leaf litter on the ground. That converts that. It helps break that vegetation down. The detritus then goes back into the soil, enriches the soil, and it also clears the way for seeds that are lying dormant in the ground to actually be able to sprout. So fire is a good thing, but it like everything, you can have too much of a good thing, and in this case, it's about as far away from that as we can get. So one of the places that's been burning pretty badly is a place called Kangaroo Island, which is an island off the south coast of South Australia. Kangaroo Island was joined to the mainland approximately about 200,000 years ago, so there is quite a way off the mainland there. And so as a result, there is a little bit of island endemicism going on Kangaroo Island. And there's a small mammal called the Kangaroo Island dunnart that was already greatly affected from humans by habitat fragmentation and destruction. And we've basically contracted its range into a couple of areas of the national park there. That national park has, where those animals have been previously been found, have been completely wiped out by fires. So where these guys usually live under small logs and rocks and in vegetation and stuff like that, and also into low burrows and soil cracks, that all would have been affected by fires. And so there's a very real possibility that we actually have seen an extinction from these fires, as well, in part from these fires, because what does need to be remembered is that we as humans have also completely stuffed and ruined the habitat in that area. And so by ruining the habitat in that area and introducing feral species such as cats and foxes, we've caused that range of that dunnart already to contract very significantly. So these fires have been the sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak.
Yeah, that's and no doubt that's going to happen to a few different species, as we've said as well. Kind of as you say, we're not going to fully understand exactly what's happening to these animals until we can until people can get out and actually start doing proper surveys and such forth to understand the actual damage in these areas. So, from a tackling of the fire standpoint from the Australian government, do we know what exactly is happening? Is there any ease on the fires, or do they think it's going to continue?
At the moment, from what my understandings are, the fires are all still just going pretty much as badly as they were previously. We have had some rain events in a couple of locations that have given us a bit of a reprieve, but that's then been coupled up with significant dry events and wind that has then sort of reignited those fires in other places. You can have a fire that happens to be burning in location X, and then you get a windstorm come through that can actually carry embers for 5-10 kilometres. And then those embers that are already hot now alone in some brand new bushland that is again tinder dry, and the wind goes through, and then you've got another fire that's just started somewhere else. So at the moment, it's pretty crazy. I don't think we will see a reprieve on these bushfires probably until anywhere from the end of February to into March. I'd say there will be still significant areas of Australia burning till then.
How long will they usually take, those bushfires? What is the season for them?
It usually starts in about October and then finishes in about March. So that's how long the bushfires. But usually we don't have so many bushfires all at the same time. We don't have a drought that's been infecting the environment for so long, and we don't have the intensity of those fires. But it's really been all of these factors together have caused this, for lack of a better term, like a perfect storm that has caused these problems. The other thing that needs to be remembered as well is that it's the scale of where these fires are. So usually we might have, we had some incredible fires in Victoria a couple of years ago, and then we had big fires in New South Wales a year ago. And so what was happening is that you would have firefighters from Queensland or South Australia or WA or Victoria go and assist the people in New South Wales, or they would assist the people in Victoria for their fires. At the moment, we've got significant fire events going on in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia, all at the same time, as well as WA as well. And so we are literally getting sort of hit all across the country. And the guys that are doing the fantastic work that the guys are doing, they're getting to the point now where they're really tired. It's hard work. And so Australian government and bureaucracy have got the armed services involved, the defence services are involved. Canada has sent over people. I think the US has sent over people to help us. There's been people sort of from around the world helping our crews, but we've lost. I think it's 4 or 5 firefighters have died fighting these fires. It's pretty incredible.
It's as you say, it's almost apocalyptic, and it is as an event, isn't it? For the country, it's going to be quite damaging in numerous ways from an ecological and an economy standpoint too. It's
I hate to see what insurance premiums are going to go to. That's for sure. I don't see it. I don't think the insurance companies are going to. I have no doubt that insurance companies will end up sort of putting up their premiums to cover some of the payouts that they're going to have to pay out. So there is an economic standpoint to it as well. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think this events like this just should be striving people who are keeping animals in captivity to kind of really understand the protocols of what they should be doing and how they should be protecting themselves and their animals and their properties in some ways as well to try and help mitigate the effects of these situations as on it. And I know, for instance, obviously you live in an area where flooding is quite a big thing. So understanding how flooding can affect your house or where you live, or how in this case fires can affect them, it's quite a big thing. And it's not necessarily the actual event. Sometimes it's the event that carries on after. Like these fires are probably going to affect a lot of the infrastructure around those houses. So water, electricity, things that we would naturally gas, things we would naturally think as being readily available to us as humans in our normal lives. These people, even when they do get their homes back, if they get their homes back, are probably going to be without these basic amenities for a period of time. And actually understanding how you can mitigate those situations is sometimes not thought of, and we probably should be thinking about it a little bit more.
Yeah, most definitely. So, I mean, the preparation for disasters really should be in everybody's management plans. I would urge anyone that's keeping venomous snakes to make sure that they do have a management plan of sorts. Now, whether that is an overarching document that covers how they're going to manage their collections holistically, or whether they're going to have a species management plan for each one of their animals.
This is something we've been talking about with the podcast people quite a bit. As Danny will agree, that we've been talking about actually the use of standard operating procedures or similar things to stuff like that, or code of practices that there's sometimes you may have it in your head, but what's the benefit of actually having these kind of things written down? So if a natural disaster or something, or a bite situation or something's going to happen, how would somebody else look after your collection, or what is the thing to do in those situations? Sometimes having it in your head in a panic situation, everything goes. Having a piece of paper to read can sometimes be useful.
So this is the thing. So your preparation for disasters is something that it is worthwhile thinking about beforehand. I mean, some of the disasters that come to mind that need to be dealt with, obviously, is things like flooding, fire, high heat, high cold. So it could be snow in the northern hemisphere. It could be flooding down here. It could be periods of intense heat that cause electrical disruption. If you think that you've got a route that you've got to go into the hospital, and then you can't get to that hospital because it's cut off from floodwaters, or it's cut off due to a snowstorm, and you're dealing with a bite from a taipan or something like that, it's not going to be very good. So at the end of the day, you should have these management protocols in place that it might be that you minimise interaction with those animals during these emergency disaster periods, where you make sure the animals are looked after as best you can. But if there's a poo in an enclosure, you don't clean that poo out of the enclosure. It can wait a day or two to make sure that you do have the infrastructure there if something was to go wrong. So that would be something that could be worked into a protocol fairly quickly. Backup systems in regards to electricity. I mean, for us, we have generators. We have multiple evacuation routes. We also happen to have bags for every single animal that we have. We have hard cases that will fit all those animals into it. And we have removable cage tags. Now, the whole idea of the removable cage tag system is so that in the event of an emergency, before that emergency starts, as soon as we get the warning via it, we've got an app that alerts us to a significant event that's going to happen in the region. Then from that, we can then mitigate, and we can go into our protocols. So one of those may be to bag the animals up. If we bag the animals up, then we're bagging them. We take the cage tag off, fix the cage tag to the outside of the bag. and then put those bags into hard cases. They are then locked, and the whole idea of that is that way, then if there is an event, we can take the animals with us. They are securely bagged up and they are labelled at all times. The same thing with those cage labels is that we can put those into our snake bite protocol kit as well. So if we do happen to have a bite en route to the hospital, we can actually take the cage tag with us, and that way then there's no problem as to whether or not which snake had bitten us at the time. So a little bit of prior planning makes a big difference. Generators, extension cords, and actually having the system prepped and running. At least once a year, we get our generator out, we check our generator's working properly, change the oil on it, change the fuel on it, make sure it works, because the last thing you want to do is find out that your generator's not working and, lose a freezer full of rodents and not be able to get your air conditioning working. So, and then losing animals due to heat. It's all about a bit of prior preparation. Having emergency lighting systems in the snake building itself. So if the power goes off, lights come on. So battery operated lights come on. So at least you can see what you're doing. So you're not stuck in the dark dealing with a venomous snake. There's all those sorts of things that can benefit the keepers, and that prior planning and preparation is worth its weight in gold when you actually are dealing with a disaster. That's for sure.
I think people forget about that from a venomous snake keeping aspect, is that they always think, oh, we need bite protocols, we need this, but they always forget about kind of the natural disaster size of it, power output. In Europe, we've got a lot more stable power grid. We don't suffer from the natural disasters that could affect our power here. I'm not saying that it couldn't happen, but it's less likely to happen. Whereas in the US, in Australia, some people can be very rural, where if a disaster happens, they could be it could be days before they get power back, and having that system that allows them to have a generator to keep animals cool when it's in the summer, or to keep animals warm when it's in the winter, allows you to be able to make sure that your animals are safe and such forth. But still, we do get power cuts in Europe. I had one recently for, I think it was 12 hours, but 12 hours you can kind of manage for 12 hours. But again, if I was in the snake room and my lights all of a sudden all went off, what's my emergency protocol to deal with that?
How comfortable are you going to be if you've got a rig coil at the end of a hook, and next thing you know, the lights have suddenly gone off? That rig coil's going to be a hell of a lot better in the dark than you.
Well, that's it. So I've got emergency lighting in my room, so I'm in a good position there. So it does come on if the power goes out, but still that's kind of, as you say, like, not everybody's got that, and it's not thought of by everybody, when actually we should be planning for the worst event and hoping for the best, rather than the other way around, is planning not very well and then the worst thing happening, and we're not ready to deal with it. And especially in flood or fire events, like, which are disastrous, not just for the people or the animals, but for the property, for everything else, and for whole communities and countries alike. What you shouldn't be endangering somebody else's life even more by your snakes, having venomous snakes, when their lives are already in danger with something else that they don't normally have to deal with. And I think that's something that people need to really think about, is what is your mitigation plan for these big events happening and these things happening. And they say carry on.
Sorry, the other thing is too is we can always improve on our systems. It was interesting. I was talking to somebody recently about mitigation strategies and stuff like that, and the guy happened to be a fiery, So it was quite interesting talking to him from a fire risk perspective, because the firefighters have got a certain protocols that they use when they enter a property that's potentially burning, or for whatever case it is. And apparently, one of the first places they go is they go to the electrical board to isolate the power on the property. And I was like, right, okay, well, that's interesting. And he goes, the first place we go is the electrical board. And I was like, right, okay. I said, so that would be a really good place to put a warning saying that there's venomous snakes on the premises. He goes, that'd be perfect. And so straight away, and it's something that I've actually got some labels coming, I'm going to put labels on the inside of my electrical board to say that there's venomous snakes on the property, because if I'm not there, I mean, our snake building is labelled as to what's inside and all the rest of it, but that's not our snake building's off the house. So if they were to come to our place, they wouldn't necessarily know that there was venomous snakes in the building alongside the house. And so by putting that warning in a prominent location that the fire is going to go to, that straight away tells them straight off the bat that there is a threat to them. And so it's not necessarily thinking about how you can mitigate threats for yourself, but how you can also do it for others as well.
That's quite interesting. So I'd have thought that would be quite a standard practice across firefighters around the world, because they're trying to isolate the power, isolate something that could endanger them even more in a position where they've got reduced visibility and everything else. Plus, also they'll be pumping a hell of a lot of water into a foam or whatever into the property at some point very quickly once they know the property is clear. So again, it's mitigating the damage. They're trying to mitigate the damage for people who are around the fire who aren't necessarily directly affected by the fire. So again, it's kind of going back to that point of that's them doing their mitigation for other people, whereas that's quite interesting. That's something I'd have never thought of in a million years, is to put a sticker on my fuse box where they're going to go and they're going to trip everything outside, which is outside on the inside of there, just saying that there is venomous snakes on the property.
Don't put it so it tells everybody in the complex that you live in that there's venomous snakes in the building. But if it's on the inside of that electrical box, that's the first place they're going to go. And it's a straight away warning to them. And at the end of the day, that's the people that you want to warn.
Yeah, exactly. It's it just makes sense now you've said it. It just makes kind of sense. It's mitigation, isn't it? It's disaster mitigation again. Because
I can't take credit for it. I heard it from it was the fiery that told me. So I was like, well, okay, this is actually really good. And then as soon as he said it to me, I was like, yeah. I can't believe I hadn't thought of that before. That's just a simple thing to do. So,
and it could save multiple people's lives without.
Have you ever dealt with an evacuation before? I'm assuming you did practice rounds, but have you ever dealt with a real evacuation?
We've bagged up on one instance. We bagged everything up with a flood. So we had a flood that in our driveway, we had 1,500 mil. There was 1,500 mil of water in our driveway, 1,500 mil deep in our driveway. So, we didn't have any water in the house or anything like that, or anything in the reptile building. But we had. What's that? Sorry.
As a precaution, you just backed up.
We bagged everything up because, obviously I'd much rather be bagging animals up in the dry than trying to go in flood waters trying to bag animals up. We had to move a heap of animals out of our pits as well. We've got harmless animals outside in pits, so we had to bag them up as well. Get them into dry ground and all the rest of it. So we didn't lose any of them. And we had them all bagged up. And then the protocol was that until the flood waters were receding for 12 hours, constantly receding for 12 hours, we weren't going to reintroduce them back into their enclosures until that point, because that meant that, and I wanted to check that the evacuation that my my route that I could get to the hospital, I wanted to make sure that was free as well, and that I could get to the hospital if worst case scenario, if something had gone wrong. And so I waited until that route was clear, and I was able to get to that. And then once I could get to the hospital, then it's when I chose to unbag all the snakes. And, we didn't have power at that time for about 96 hours. And I ended up getting the air conditioning system was hooked in, as well as the freezers were hooked in to the into the generators. And so we ended up moving all the food from our fridge in the house and the freezing food, the freezer food from the house, all taken all down into the snake building and all the rest of it. So, we didn't lose our food. We didn't lose our own food personally. So
you had rodent flavoured food for a few days then.
It wasn't too bad. We felt this at least. Yeah.
At least you had food.
I mean, that's realistically. So yeah, we have been through that activity once before. So pretty sort of scary thing to deal with. I know that you guys probably know Jim Harrison and Kristen Wiley over at the Kentucky Reptile Zoo. Those guys have got protocols in place for snow and for flooding and how they deal with certain animals on certain days during those times. It's something that people need to consider. So.
Sorry, I was just about to sneeze and it's gone off. Yeah, I think depending on which areas you live in, like we have friends that live in Finland and stuff, and they have times of the year where their work is even their work closes due to those the conditions, and they have to think about their routes to hospitals. Are they clear and stuff like that, as to if they interact with their animals. And I think sometimes you forget when you're in an area that doesn't naturally suffer from certain things, like i.e. even snow can be a disaster, depending on how much snow has fallen. It can really affect a lot of things, or fire, or that if you don't have those things very often, you don't think about it too much. But it's also things like being able to mitigate for traffic and such forth in holiday-based times as well, like around Christmas and New Year, having a mitigation plan around when you should be handling what you should be handling around those days as well is something that people just don't really think about sometimes, and we should be making sure that our route to hospital is as clear as it possibly be. It could be handling in rush hour peak traffic times. Is that a smart thing to do? Something goes wrong. Reality of it is, is the ambulance then got to try and get through a set of traffic as well to get you to your nearest hospital, get you to your preferred hospital? It's not just mitigation.
One of the things that we do here is that I actually, obviously I drive to work, and so one of the things that I do about once every 3 weeks or so, I make sure that I drive past the hospital, the two hospitals that sit in our bite protocols. And there is a reason for that. The reason we drive past them is we want to make sure that there's no massive construction happening at those two hospitals during the time, because if there's massive construction events in a hospital itself, that may change the availability of their emergency facilities or the stocks that they keep in their pharmacies via anti-venom or support drugs or anything like that. So, we assume that when we do these bite protocols up and our mitigation plans, that they are accurate at the time that we do them. What we've got to remember is it's really important to do reviews to those emergency management plans, and just to ensure that those hospitals are still stocking that type of anti-venom, or that that hospital still does deal with this, that, or the other. And it's something certainly to keep an eye on. If you've got a bit of a drive to that hospital, something to keep in place might be significant road work events and things like that. In places in Europe where the infrastructure is fairly set in stone, so to speak, and there isn't too much change, it may not be so much of an issue. But certainly here in Australia, we're always changing our infrastructure and improving our roads and improving our facilities with a growing population, as I'm sure you can understand. That does mean changes to infrastructure, and that infrastructure can affect your management plans. So.
And all that stuff is really important that we keep on top of it. It is really important. So, kind of, I think we should from there we can take it back a little bit back towards the fires, because I think there's a lot of things that, as you say, that right now hospitals are going to be around. Most regions are going to be full of emergency care of people and such forth that are suffering from the effects of the fire. And something that was you mentioned before was about the air quality right now is worse than a lot of places around the world that are known for poor air quality, i.e. Beijing with the smog and such forth, and kind of how that's going to, and no doubt that's going to start affecting people pretty quickly.
Yeah, potentially you've got increased allergy problems. You've also got increases in asthma. Any of those sort of respiratory diseases can cause. Have seen a jump in, and I mean having a jump in those also means that there's a jump in the amount of emergency beds and things like that are being taken up from these disasters. The other problem that we're seeing at the moment is wildlife carers and vets are basically at their wits' end a little bit as well, dealing with a whole heap of animals that have been affected by the fires, and so that whole system is really at almost a breaking point in some places. So.
Well, I think there's a video going around right now of like 30 koalas in somebody's car and stuff, like in a vet's car where they're trying to collect all the koalas up and stuff. It's
I can't even watch it.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrible. It's like the amount of animals that are now gone into this veterinary care, into your veterinary care system. It's going to be putting a lot of pressure on a lot of people that aren't necessarily directly affected, but they're affected in that way.
Well, I mean, taking into consideration, we'll bring it back to venomous snakes, is that you've got a whole heap of reptiles, including venomous snakes, that are now going into care. And you've got to have people that can look after those things. Applying burn ointments to things like eastern brown snakes and tiger snakes is not an easy job for an experienced person doing venomous work, let alone a wildlife carer that's got minimal experience or a vet. So that there is a lot of those problems that are going on as well, and because it's not cuddly, it doesn't tend to get picked up by the news agencies. So there is quite a significant toll happening there as well.
Yeah, I think that's, as you say, that's quite dangerous for people and for the healthcare system if we've got people that aren't necessarily used to dealing with these animals. All of a sudden, they're being thrust into a position where they're having to tube an animal, try and pin an animal that they're not used to, or even just move an animal that's going to be in quite a lot of pain, and it's probably not going to be in the greatest of moods as well, because no doubt any of the brown snakes, as we know, any of the brown snakes, when they're not injured, are not particularly the easiest animals to handle in the world, and taipans and such forth, not the easiest animals to handle in the world. Then all of a sudden you've got a taipan that's in pain and in distress. It's going to be a lot more defensive. It's going to be a lot more flighty. It's going to be trying to get away more. And then you've got somebody who doesn't deal with these animals. That's an emergency situation in itself, without what's happening outside the front doors.
Of course,
it's pretty much a disaster for the disaster waiting to happen, isn't it? Especially in a time where I think Australia's got pretty much a good handle on its human to wildlife interaction basis regards injuries and deaths and such forth. I think it's probably one of the best in the world for that. And then all of a sudden, you've got people have forced into a position of unsafety, and through nobody's fault. It's a scary situation.
Has there been a noticeable uprising in bites or contacts?
No, there hasn't been a noticeable uprising in bites. It's very unclear as to how many bites occur on a daily basis in Australia, and then what percentage of those are legitimate bites versus illegitimate bites. And when I say illegitimate bites, I'm talking about snake people that are deliberately interacting with their snakes, whether they're keepers or snake catchers that are dealing with snakes, as opposed to people that are just out in the environment and they put their hand over a log or something and get a bite from a snake, or step on a snake or something like that as they're moving around. It does happen over here fairly regularly, especially in the warmer months with activity periods and people coming into contact with snakes. A large percentage of those bites aren't medically significant, but there certainly is a percentage that are. There was recently a death not too long ago here in Australia where a person died from I think it was a brown snake bite, as I recall. But I certainly know of about 8 bites to captive keepers in the last 8 weeks or so in Australia. By through sort of hearing things through the grapevine, and that's been during this fire period, and some of those bites have occurred in some of those areas where there has been fires. So one of the questions is that I asked the people, I said, did you need to be dealing with those snakes at the time? And the question every time was, now I think about it, probably not. And so that's a burden that's happened on our emergency services during that period.
It seems quite. So you say to me 8 bites in 8 weeks from private keepers. I feel like that. If somebody was to tell me that statistic for the UK or Europe, I would be like, well, that's quite a lot of bites. And then, as you say, people are probably more people are keeping native venomous snakes in Australia than in Europe, probably would make.
Well, there's almost next to no. I mean, there's some. I'd be very surprised if people weren't keeping exotic venomous snakes illegally here in Australia. But essentially, all our species that people are being kept are native, and so you are going to have people that are keeping native venomous snakes. At this time of year too, a lot of things are being bred. So we're starting to see eggs hatching and things like that. So there is baby snakes out there. So there's an increased amount of that. Force feeding baby snakes, as I'm sure you guys are aware, sometimes can be a little bit problematic and difficult. And if you've got somebody that's not necessarily greatly experienced with that, then that's how bites happen. And there's a fairly large venomous keeping community here in Australia as well, and of those people that are keeping venomous snakes, for them to get a bite, whether it be when they're catching a snake out of a house or whether they're dealing with one of their captive individuals, it's not that unusual, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's. I just think again, we don't live with snakes here, so it's less likely to happen. But as you say, that all those instances, those eight people being bitten, and you saying to them, could you have not been could you have not just left them and dealt with them at a better time, especially when there's a national disaster going on?
Sorry. I'll be clear about that. I've only spoken to 2 of those people.
Oh, okay.
And of those 2 people that had been bitten that I'd spoken to, they didn't have to deal with the animal at the time. So they probably could have avoided the bite, or they could have avoided the bite by better management, I suppose, of what they were doing. And I mean, one of the leading causes of snake bites is complacency, isn't it? So it's just making sure that you're not complacent when dealing with these things. So, sure.
and I think a lot of people as well, especially we all forget that sometimes things can always wait unless it's emergency medical treatment for the animal. The animal, more than likely, is going to be there the day after or 2 days later, as long as it's got the basic needs, it's got water and such forth, and food when it needs the food and heat. But in an emergency situation, a natural disaster situation where a lot of Australia is right now, keeping animals alive by giving bare basics is probably better than doing some of these more complicated procedures that probably can wait, and which and I think that is as you say, it is complacency to the situation rather than to the handling. Sometimes rather than to the handling, you say putting extra pressure onto emergency services that are already highly under quite a lot of strain and pressure right now. It's again, it's all disaster mitigation and what you should be doing in certain situations. It's like from a personal standpoint and things, something I've discussed numerous times with people, including my own fire service, is that if my house is on fire and my snake room is luckily off my house, but if my snake room is on fire, the door is locked and it gets burnt to the floor, because putting myself in that situation where I'm in the chance of being burnt and being bitten, or the fire, or me being bitten, going into anaphylactic shock, nobody can help me out, and I end up in a heap on the floor, and then there's snakes somebody else has got to put themselves in a situation with venomous snakes where they've got no experience whatsoever with snakes, probably, and they've got to go and get me out of there before I get burned to death, and they've also got to treat me for a bite. So it's putting extra effort into the emergency services that aren't necessarily needed. But I know a lot of people don't think that way. A lot of people will think that actually what they need to do is get their animals out of there, whatever happens, because they've got an emotional attachment to it. But you're putting so many people at risk by doing so that actually is the best option to allow, and however hard it will be, is to get the humans and the people and the animals that you can save that aren't going to harm other people out of that situation, and then reassess the situation. Can you then get your other animals out of there? Yes or no?
So the one question that I've posed to people in the past on that is that how well do you think that the police or how well do you think other people are going to care for your animals if you're not there? So the reality of it is that you should be looking after yourself first. The life of a person should hold more weight than the life of an animal. And so, as much as I hate to say it, the animals don't come first, the people come first, and the animals come second. So it's something that people need to understand, I suppose. And so, with prior preparation and planning, we can make sure that our animals, in the case of an emergency situation where we do have some warning, like a fire or a flood or really bad conditions, we can mitigate our interactions with our animals in such a way that we go, okay, well, no, unless it's an emergency treatment, with an emergency situation, we're not going to be interacting with those animals. We're not going to do our normal daily maintenance in those enclosures. We will do what we need to do. We'll monitor the situation and we'll reassess in a certain period of time. And so, it might mean that you're capturing animals up to put into bags, or it might mean that you're locking the enclosures and sitting there in the room waiting until the all clear goes by, and you can then go through and do what you need to do to clean those enclosures and stuff like that when the disaster period has waned.
I do it at least once every episode where I just start talking on mute. I've done it again. Yeah, I agree. I agree, and I think it's more prevalent to sometimes to bigger collections like yourself, where you have 80 plus elapids plus a lot of other non-venomous animals as well, and compared to a smaller collection like mine and Danny's, where we've got from 0 to 20 snakes. I think it does make a big difference on that, because obviously yours takes a lot more effort and time to do basic maintenance, compared to us. If we're just doing basic maintenance, we're in and out within 15-20 minutes. You're in and out within 2 hours. It does make a big difference to that.
My wife is, I'm lucky, my wife's actually a full-on herper as well, Ty, and she deals with all the stuff as well, and she deals with the animals as a full-time job. So so we probably put on a daily basis into our animals where we're spending anywhere between 3 and 6 hours every day working with our collection of critters. So there's a fair bit of interaction, whether it be prepping for meals or cleaning enclosures or doing what needs to be done. So 20 minutes to go through and do a quick walk through the collection. I haven't had that in many years, I can tell you that.
And I think that's.
But we do what we love too. Don't get me wrong.
I think that's the difference between where it becomes a as you say, Ty. She pretty much does it as her full-time job. That's what she does, is looks after your animals, because you can't.
Animals together. Yeah.
It is a full-time job at that point, and as you say, it becomes a profession. Maybe you could argue that then it becomes more of a professional collection at that point, because
for us, it definitely is. We do demonstrations and stuff like that. So for us, it's the animals are our business. Nature for You is a business for working with wildlife, and the collection is part of that work. So in our case, it is a professional. It's not really a private collection; it's a professional collection, I suppose. It just hasn't happened to be open to the public.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think I'm actually going to take it onto your collection slightly. I know we weren't going to do that with this episode, because since we've last spoken, you've had a bit of a dream animal of yours, I believe.
Oh yeah, the butler snakes. I've been wanting butler snakes for about 20 odd years, and they cost an absolute mozza, and which is a lot of money. That means a lot of money in Australia. Sorry, I just went into Australian slang for a minute. They cost a hell of a lot. And a couple of friends of ours, John and Tina Mostyn down in New South Wales, they happened to breed them, and we ended up picking some up for a very good price. And I was incredibly excited about picking them up, and my wife thought it was quite funny. She hasn't seen me so excited over a snake in a long time. So, but they've settled in really well now. They're out of quarantine and putting on size. So hopefully next year they'll be at a size big enough that we can that I can try and breed them. So
they are rather nice looking snakes.
They are absolutely incredible, and they work completely different to every other black snake or the black snake group that we've worked with. They're much quicker, and they're quite. They seem to be quite intelligent as well as black snakes go. They seem to watch what's going on around them, and they're very fast moving, and they're quite quick to show me how quickly they can move when they want to.
When an Australian says they're quite fast moving, it makes me wonder how fast they are, because I don't think there's any slow Australian snakes, is there?
They're almost as fast as a brown snake. You know, they're fairly quick. Look at our fastest snakes. It's a toss up between our taipans and our eastern browns and our dugots. All of those very fast-moving elapids. But you're splitting hairs whether a taipan or an Eastern brown chasing food. You're splitting hairs on which one's faster.
I'd rather
from
not
our
check
point
either.
and neither do we. So we use things like passive feeding techniques. So a passive feeding technique that we use is that so we defrost rodents in a different room to the where the animals are, and so when we're defrosting rodents, they go into a different room. And the first snakes that we feed when we go into that room is we feed the taipans and then we feed the brown snakes. Because the minute that you start bringing rodents into the snake building is the minute that you start getting snakes seem to start coming out from underneath the paper and coming out from their under their hides and all the rest of it and coming to the front doors or of the enclosures ready to be fed. So it's much easier to deal with taipans that don't realise that there's food in the enclosure. And so we can open up the enclosure and then using tools put the food straight into the enclosure, shut the door, and then within a couple of minutes the animals come out and have a feed. The whole idea of feeding in that passive way, as opposed to an exciting feed strategy where you're wiggling a rodent on the end of tongs, it means that the animals don't fly around the enclosure and don't get excited at food time as much. And while it's not so exciting to see, for us, watching a snake feed isn't the most exciting thing in the world. We see it a fair bit. So I must admit, I find that it's much more exciting for me to deal with a nice, pleasant snake to deal with than one that's very excited every time it sees you, thinking it's going to get fed. So we do try and use a passive food technique wherever we can. So,
again, this still goes.
Great tip for everybody. It's a great set of info. This. I'm not sure everyone applies this, but I do the same. I defrost them in another room and go on from there. And nothing to introduce the rodents to the snakes before. I don't want to get them. I don't want to deal with excited snakes.
No, excited snakes can do things. Can do things that snakes shouldn't be able to do. It seems at times. They can move.
Danny has a lot of snakes that you could argue are kind of in a similar field to brown snakes and taipans with bothrops, which they're going to, when they're excited, they're fast, they're flighty, they're
not fun.
Pogo stick. So having doing that again, it's going back to having a code of practice or a standard operating procedure where you've got this written down that you kind of say like, look, for the point of remembering, saying using this kind of feeding technique, I find works better because of safety for X, Y, and Z. And it's going back to that mitigation, that disaster mitigation. You're trying to mitigate a bite situation, so you're trying to mitigate against the bite by doing this set of protocols, by defrosting in another room, feeding taipans first, by what we would call it drop feeding, because you drop it in and you leave and you walk away, by drop feeding and not having to deal with a snake that's flighty and such forth and aggressive, being food aggressive or food defensive, however you want to call it, food orientated. And it's just mitigating for that bite situation. You're trying to not put yourself or somebody else in that position of where they could get bitten. And again,
you're always going to have that with certain species. Though, so I mean, by the time I'm getting to the sort of the end of the animals that we're dealing with, we tend to go taipans, brown snakes, and then after that it doesn't really matter to us too much whether we're dealing with a black snake or a tiger snake or a death adder or whatever. It's all pretty much the same in that sense. But at the same time, that the speed that a large, we've got some fairly large mulga snakes here and large collet snakes and red-bellied blacks and spotted blacks. They'll come flying out the enclosure and they'll start chewing on the door, or they'll chew on the track, or they'll chew on the water bowl or whatever, and they will do it with a fair bit of gusto, and they will sit there chewing on the side of that door until they decide that the rodent is better to chew on than the door. And it can be quite difficult, and it can be quite surprising how fast these things can move. And by going to that passive feeding technique, we find that we have less excited snakes when we first open the enclosures, even for cleaning, because the animals, as soon as you go into that enclosure and you're pulling that snake out, the animals are going, well, this isn't a feeding strategy, this is something else, and they don't go into that food mode initially. So it makes for a better captives, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. I use a passive feeding technique, except for one of my animals. That's because of a social feeding situation. I just try and encourage a natural feeding behaviour that animal shows. But yeah, I think that this is all really good information. As Danny says, really good information that kind of we can always pull this back to mitigate different mitigation techniques and protocols that people should be doing and should be understanding when they start having a collection of venomous snakes, because unfortunately it can be life threatening, and that as well.
So one thing that, and I'm trying to figure out a way of doing it at the moment. It's something that we have, and we utilise them in some of our enclosures, not all of them. We pick and choose where we want to put them. We've got plastic shift boxes that we've made up, and that we've made them in a I suppose the best way to describe it is a bit like the Russian doll system. So if you remember the Russian dolls that fit inside each other, one of the things that we've done is we've got a plastic container that's got a lid on it. That plastic container with the lid on it has a hole drilled into it, and so that what we can do is we can then get another container that will then sit over the top of that container that sits inside the enclosure and locks it off, and that means that if the animal's sitting inside that plastic hide, then the animal's then safely locked away, and then you can take that whole plastic hide out and then put that into a holding container while you service the enclosure, or change water bowls or do anything that you need to do. And it's a very, very simple, easy system, and literally costs about $10 Australian at the local supermarket to put a shift box in place for your snakes. And one of the things we're experimenting now with is we're trying to actually find almost a micro version that we can put into our juvenile holding enclosures, so that if we're having to deal with baby elapids, we can utilise a similar system, and so we're not having to try and hook out a ridiculously fast baby elapid to move it from one enclosure to another. We can just use one of these little shift boxes that we're making up to go into these tiny drawers.
And I think that it's quite a done thing in certain circles, especially, as you say, with elapids, especially because certain species of snake unfortunately won't use shift boxes as readily as others. However, it is seen that you can. Well, it is readily used by certain people. I personally don't have any shift boxes, but I don't have any animals that warrant a shift box, really. So, but I can see the importance of how it can work and how it can help you, especially with a collection as large as yours as well. So,
well, I've never, having said that, I've never had a death adder go into a shift box, but I've never tried. But at the same time, just about if you set your shift boxes up in such a way, it can make life easy for you, that's for sure, with certain animals, and it makes the interaction and the dealing with those particular animals a much more pleasant experience at times as well, because nobody really likes being struck at by venomous snakes all the time. It does get a little bit tedious after a while, that's for sure.
Yeah, it does.
Well, I think there is papers and research that show that positive reinforcement with mambas leads them to using shift boxes and such forth. I think there has been studies done on it.
You could trick them into using them. Same as vipers. You could trick them into using them. Just place food in it or something, and they'll find a safe place in it, and they'll start using it essentially.
Yeah,
I know that there was one of the zoo systems. One of the zoos had a feeding box that they used to feed their members in, and when they went to defrost rodents, the animals, obviously the snakes, would be able to smell it. They would open up the shift box that the members could go into, so they'd come off display, go into this shift box, and this shift box had a port that they could drop a mouse through, and it had a port that they could drop the mouse through. They could shut the lid on the port and then pull a slide out from the port, and then that would drop the rodent into the shift box in with the mamba, and the members were fed only in the shift box. And so whenever the animal was needed to be cleaned or needed to be maintained or anything like that, all they'd do is they'd just open up the food door to the shift box. The snake would readily go into the shift box. They could close that off. They could do all the enclosure maintenance that they wanted to do, and then they could also feed the snake as well. They could also when they shut the door off to that shift box could then be from the enclosure. That shift box could be removed off the back of the enclosure. It could be cleaned. It could be serviced itself. And then the other thing they could do is they could actually take the shift box off with the snake in it, and then that could be taken into a medical room, and they could put anaesthetising gas if they needed to into the shift box, and then they could actually treat the snake in a veterinary situation if they needed to, without ever needing to actually put their hands on the snake while it was still conscious. So, that's a very extreme example of what can happen and what people can do. Personally, I think that you do need to have the skill set to still be able to manually deal with the animals that you are keeping.
You need to keep sharp. I think.
Yeah, I think you need to be able to still handle the animals, and whether that be you need to be able to pin, you need to be able to hook, you need to be able to deal with those animals without the use of a shift box. But that shift box just becomes another tool. We've got hoop bags that we use as well.
Yeah, this is something Ed always speaks about at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, that when they always do their box cleaning and such forth in their procedure room. So what they have a trolley, they shift the animals are all kept in like the plastic boxes with the clip lids, because for sterile reasons and such forth, with it being a professional collection, and then they drop all of them onto the trolley. And he says the mambas, the one thing the mambas do is that they will go into the shift box through the vibration of the trolley. They'll all go into the shift box, so it makes actually doing certain species of the mambas really easy to deal with, because you just straight away you get them. They're in the shift box. You lock the door, pick the box out, sort the box out, put them back in, lid back on the trolley, off they go. And there's actually hardly any interaction with certain species of snake that they have there, because they have that recognition of being on the trolley and the vibration of being pushed from one room to another to be cleaned and for the boxes to be sorted. They go, oh, okay, recognition. I'm either got to deal with a person, or I go into my safe place and the door goes back open and I've not got to deal with anything. And it can make a big difference to them and how they work, which is interesting. Which I found quite interesting. Is they say it's a learned behaviour from that one individual position, and if one animal can do it, there's reality of it is a lot more snakes are probably a lot more intelligent than we give them credit for.
Look, reptile intelligence is something that's pretty incredible. I mean, our facility here that we've got a timing system that works on with regards to the heating for our larger enclosures on the outside, and so we've got heat cords that sit underneath ceramic tiles. They're set up on a timer that comes on during as a thermal mosaic during the day. So you sort of interacts with if you can imagine a cloudy day, the sun comes out, heats up the rock for a bit, then a cloud comes over and lets the rock cool down. So we've got a heating strategy that goes up and down during the day. And about half an hour before the heat comes on, you'll quite often see the taipans and the brown snakes and the black snakes and the tiger snakes will all be curled up, sitting on the area where it is going to get heat before it actually heats up, because they know that area is going to heat up in a fairly short time period. And they learnt that strategy within about 3 weeks. How quickly what time of day that the heating comes on, and likewise, the heating comes on in the morning, then there's a lull through the day, and then the heating comes on again in the late afternoon. And in the late afternoon, the snakes will then go and curl up on the heat before the heating comes on. They'll get warm, and then they'll go and do their normal day activities. So that they are much more intelligent than we give them credit for. That's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that one. With an eye on the time, unfortunately, I think that is all that we're going to have time for to speak about today. Unfortunately, I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming on again. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. You've always got so much information and so much knowledge on a lot of these things that it's really useful to have that interaction with yourself and this time with yourself for us to talk about things that's happening over there in Australia, and also for us to kind of for you to be able to share your wealth of knowledge around the world, because I think a lot of people benefit with a lot of the stuff you say. And I think one of the things you seem to be really, really big on is your different types of protocol that you use, and how to and mitigation for a lot of these things. And so thank you so much.
No worries. I'll just quickly, while I got the opportunity, I'll throw this out there. I'm going to be in the States with my wife for Herpeton, a reptile conference that's happening in San Diego at the end of April. And we're hoping to get out and see some native and also exotic venomous snakes. So if any of the listeners want to get in contact with me and tell me about some spots where they've got stuff, or they want to show me some snakes, I'll be very keen to be in contact. So that's the Herpeton conference in San Diego at the end of April.
That'll be really interesting event to go to, and hopefully you'll get to see a lot of different types of collections while you're out there from various people. So I'd just like to, yeah, thank you very much for coming on again, Scott. And I'd just like to thank our listeners for listening again, as usual. Please like and share this episode. Please also give us a review on our Facebook page and also on the podcasting platforms. More people that review the episodes or review the podcast, the more people will see the episodes as well. Also, I'd just like to remind everybody that wordonthesnakevine.co.uk is our website where all our episodes are available. There is also some merchandise available on the website also, and any profit from that merchandise sales goes back into snakebite charities around the world. And also, we also have a Patreon group. If you'd like to join our Patreon group, the link is in the description. Please do. And any money made on Patreon, again, goes towards snakebite and snake conservation charities also. So thank you very much all for listening, and good night.